We've got 4 people with us today, all with significant experience in the topic. On the left here is Adam Thierer. I'm sure most of you are familiar with Adam. He's been in this business for a very long time. Presently, the Senior Research Fellow with the Technology Policy Program at Mercatus. George Mason writes a lot, Wall Street Journal, Economist, 8 books. His most recent book is Permissionless Innovation. So obviously, he's a fine candidate for this panel. He has a MA in International Business and Trade Theory from Maryland. We have Wayne Leighton over here. He's the chief of the FCC's Office of Strategic Plans and Policy. He plays a very important role at the Commission. He's also leading the establishment of the FCC's future Office of Economics and Analytics, which is a shop I was sort of in at one point years ago. It was subsequently shut down. Reed Hunt created that, and the difference I think would be that there we had 3, maybe 4 economists and 20 lawyers. So it was almost a fair fight for the lawyers, but I think there's just a little thin on the economist side, but that's the way that the Commission works. Wayne has a PhD in economics, so he's a smart boy, and he also went to Texas A&M, and I understand that he advised the university that a football coach is worth $75 million. Jeff Blum over here on my left is a senior vice president for 11 years, deputy general counsel of Dish Network. I think Dish, if you know anything about telecom, you know Dish is sort of always at the boundary of innovation and spectrum and product. So we're glad to have his perspective on trying to negotiate the process. Also, something I did not know about Jeff, I read his bio, was that he litigated the Grogster case and was on the winning side of that, of course. But he does have a law degree from Boston University School of Law. And finally, we're honored today to have Admiral Allen, who I met a few weeks ago out in California. If you don't recognize his name and his face, you'll recognize his voice with his face. He's seen him a lot of television. He's an admiral in the U.S. Coast Guard, 23rd Commandant of the U.S. Coast Guard. He's now retired. We certainly appreciate your service to the country in those roles. But not only that, he also served President Bush for the Katrina recovery, the Hurricane Rita recovery, and President Obama for the Gulf Oil spill as the primary representative between the Gulf, between the oil company and the government. He's done many things. I could honestly give him the microphone and let him sit here and talk for an hour, and you'd never be bored. We're glad he's here. He's presently a senior executive advisor at Booz Hamilton. He has multiple master's degrees, multiple honorary doctorates, and is a graduate of the U.S. Coast Guard. Innovation, competition, and jobs. These are 3 words that are used a lot and abused a lot in telecommunications policy. I count them as the top 3 on the list of telecom bullshit bingo. But what's funny about innovation in particular is I was at a panel in New Zealand, and I asked the Ministry of Innovation there, they have something called that. I said, well, why do you define innovation? And they sort of looked at me and you heard a pin drop. And we don't know really how to define it. Economists define it as an investment made that reduces marginal cost, generally, that's how we model it, or destroys incumbent technology, which is sort of the Schumpeterian deal, which we'll talk about in just a second. But I think it's a bit like pornography. We don't really know how to define it, but we kind of know it when we see it. An iPhone, VoIP, things like this that come around and really shape the business to its core, or the existing businesses at their core. So we're going to spend a little time talking about that, not so much to define it, because I don't think you really can. try to bring some serious thought here to what is innovation, what causes it, and how does the government handle it? And how does the government stand in the way? How does it encourage it? Should it encourage it? Should it stand in the way? Does it really, can it guide it? Can it cause it? Or does it just guide it? Things like that. But the Joseph Schumpeter is in the title of the session. I'm going to let Wayne talk a little bit about that. He and I both were raised in economics programs that appreciated the history of economic thought. And Schumpeter was certainly a star in that field for American for the economic study here in America and globally. Wayne, I know you've talked about it. We've talked about it. He actually has the book here. So he's going to spend a second telling us a little bit about what we mean by creative destruction and how it's not really what a lot of people think it is, at least the way we use it in modern telecommunications policy.
Thanks, George. And so thanks for the invitation. As the only current government employee on this panel and the next, I have to give the standard disclaimer, which is that nothing I say represents the views of the U.S. government, chairman of the FCC, commissioner of the FCC, staff of the FCC. Don't speak for my mom, don't speak for my dad, certainly don't speak for my wife. We have a 4-year-old girl, and so far I still speak for her. That could change. But, so with that, I think it's very timely to have a conversation about creative destruction, and so I appreciate you asking the question and making me go back and read a book that I read 25 years ago, which is Joseph Schumpeter's Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy, which is one of those books that one should go back and read from time to time, or classic works. For those of us who work in the communications field, it's worth going back every now and then and reading Ronald Coase, 1959 Federal Communications Commission, 1960 The Problem of Social Costs. Pretty much any economist working in Washington, D.C. or anywhere else, it's worth going back and reading Friedrich Hayek's essay, The Use of Knowledge in Society, Thomas Sowell's book, Knowledge and Decisions, and Thieer's Permissionless Innovation is the kind of work that needs a look on a regular basis. You go back and you see the arguments and you see them in a fresh light. Another reason why I think Schumpeter is particularly relevant today is the message he was trying to convey was written between 1939, he published in 1942, so about 3 years, Schumpeter's writing at the end of the biggest crisis in capitalism. A lot of people doubting the value of the capitalist approach, markets in general, a lot of strife, war. And a lot of comfort with populist arguments, a lot of discomfort with innovation, a lot of discomfort with radical change that the capitalists wanted to give. That was what was going on then. It speaks to a great extent with a lot of the anxiety a lot of people feel right now. And Schumpeter is extremely careful in the way he writes. He has chapters that begin, "Can capitalism continue?" First sentence is, "No, I do not think it can." Or, can socialism work? "Yes, I believe so." And he proceeds to talk about all the conditions that must hold for socialism to work, and the careful reader understands that those conditions are really never met. Or, can capitalism work? "Well, I'm not so sure, I don't think so, but it does all these very, very important things." And as a matter of fact, as you read Schumpeter very carefully, you realize that he sees markets as this great engine, this great opportunity for innovation to come about, innovation which changes things and allows for human well-being to improve dramatically. And in one of the shortest chapters in the book, and one of the shortest sections of the book on capitalism, there's a discussion of destruction, which is the title we have before us today. And Schumpeter uses those two words together very carefully. We capitalize, creative destruction, and they are about the ability, or rather how, the capitalist order destroys inefficient business models, inefficient ways of doing things, and replaces them with something new, something better. By the way, those inefficient models may have been very efficient a few years ago. It's extremely important to understand. They don't necessarily exist because of some nefarious act. They were probably quite efficient for a long time. And then they kind of sort of into what they are. And entrepreneurs, innovators, forward-looking folks come up with ideas for ways to change, ways to do something better. And these gales, the gale of destruction that Schumpeter refers to in this book, is a critical element of the natural capitalist order. So I think it's very important to keep this in mind when we have this discussion, and we're saying, is creative destruction important or relevant? Can it exist today? I'll kind of end with my takeaway for the panel, which is failure. Business failure is feedback. It says something is no longer working, and here's an opportunity for something better to come forward. New entrepreneurs can come forward and do something inside. Creative destruction is something we should not thwart. We, regulators, politicians, policymakers, business leaders, intellectuals, we should not try to thwart it. We should allow failure to happen. We should allow new business models to come forward. And if we try to thwart that process, we will do so at a time.
Thank you, Wayne, and that's what I think what's interesting about the analysis that Schumpeter offered was the destruction was not destruction just of businesses, but destruction of the capitalist process itself, the system itself, that innovation destroys other people's wealth, resistance builds, and the system, and there's a war against capitalism because the foundation of capitalism is the innovative process. That's what he introduced, the entrepreneur, to economic analysis. I think that plays right into Adam's book, where there's this disagreement in society about innovation, whether we should encourage, accept, embrace, deter. Adam, will you briefly give us the review of the general thesis of your recent book?
Sure, and thanks for inviting me, George, and the Phoenix Center. Congratulations on another excellent event. I really appreciate being here. So the themes that we're talking about on the panel here today about Schumpeterian change were very much core of the discussion that I had in my book, which was an effort to discuss the so-called conflict of visions, if you will, between the sort of two paradigmatic visions that guide technology policy discussions at each and every juncture. One of which is very well known and has always had a name, which is generally referred to as the cautionary principle mindset, or the idea that basically new innovations should be considered sort of, in essence, guilty until proven innocent, and that basically you need to come get someone's prior blood blessing or permission before you launch a new product or service into the world, on the theory that it could cause some theoretical harm, and we should anticipate it and try to figure out how to solve for that before we allow that innovation to occur. That, again, is sort of the cautionary vision, and that entails a lot of preemptive, restrictive, permitting-based processes, licensing rules and regulations, so on and so forth. We didn't really have in the literature a good antithesis for that, a good name for the antithesis of that vision. People just call it markets or capitalism or whatever else. But really then along came the rise of the internet, the digital economy, and we started hearing this phrase, which I still don't have any idea who originally coined it, but permissionless innovation.
Tim Wu.
It was not Tim. It was not Tim. Do not give him credit for this. The closest I can find to who actually came to coining this idea or this notion was Rear Admiral Grace Hopper, who was a computer scientist in the Navy, who famously once said, when asked in an interview how she ever got any innovation accomplished in the giant bureaucracy that is the U.S. Navy as a computer scientist, she said, well, it's always easier to ask for forgiveness than to get permission first. And basically that became the ethos that guided a large part of the digital innovation that we saw behind the internet revolution. And so later people came to refer to this as permissionless innovation. And really that's the sort of antithesis of the precautionary principle. And in each and every public policy debate regarding existing or emerging technology policy, you see the tension between these two sorts of visions. Those who believe that you first need to come get some sort of prior blessing or approval before you can launch that new and better mousetrap in the world and change the world for the better, versus those of us who believe that innovation should be innocent until proven guilty. And that basically you should be able to give a chance to go out there and give it a shot without necessarily always going through some sort of a laborious permitting process or regulatory system. This is particularly important as we loop it back to Schumpeter when you think about creative destruction and the emergence of new markets. Because one of the ways we do not get the emergence of new technologies, new innovators, new markets, is because we basically seal into place old regulatory regimes or systems that are stodgy and basically protect incumbents or old business models or business practices or whatever else. And so the single most important thing I would argue that we can do to make sure that Schumpeterian creative destruction continues apace is to make sure that we identify and remove as quickly as possible barriers to that sort of creative destruction. And obviously, in a world that we live in here inside the Beltway, this is what a huge, number of basically people exist to stop. Not just the regulators, but of course even affected interests who have an interest in preserving the status quo, including the regulatory permissioning process.
And not only do we have the word Admiral, but we have the military's role in innovation. Admiral, you've navigated government agencies, private sector relationships, and innovation and progress many times. What do you see as the current role of the government in the innovative process?
Thanks. First, let me start off with my disclaimer. I'm retired, my pension's assured, I have 1 foot in assisted living, and I do speak for myself. And regarding creative destruction, I'm so old that when I took economics as part of my MBA program at GW, we were still talking about the free rider effect for television and radio. And I started the Coast Guard Academy with a sliding rule. And I ended the war in Vietnam as a commanding officer where I had a sea station in Thailand that's subsequently been displaced by GPS, so one lifetime. Technology happens. And I would tell you there's no barrier to entry. If you want to work in the dark web today, you can go get a computer at a big box store and get an IP address and you're in. So I would say one of the things that's happened with technology happens. I think one of the things that's happened is technology is evolving more rapidly. And again, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not an economist, I'm just a simple sailor, but this all stuff is happening more rapidly than legal, policy, regulatory frameworks. And as you stated, I'll restate it another way, the CFR and the FAR are some of all market failures. It's like driving down a highway by steering looking in the rearview mirror. I was at an intelligent vehicle conference a year or so ago in Detroit with the Secretary of Transportation of Mary Barr and the CEO of GM, trying to talk about how you do rulemaking in NHTSA for intelligent vehicles. When I, as a Commandant of the Coast Guard, could not get a rule out anywhere between 5 and 10 years. Folks, that dog don't hunt. I got so exasperated in the Administrative Procedures Act that I resorted to the only thing I could do, and that was hire more economists. Help speed up the process in my own agency. So what the problem we've got, in my view, is that the government's never been able to acquire, ingest, and deploy technology as fast as the private sector, and there are reasons for that, intentional reasons for that. That stern chase has existed, but the technology's accelerating so fast now the stern chase is widening. The secondary effect of that is the expertise to actually oversee an industry which you have regulatory authority over. So as a Commandant of the Coast Guard, I was pretty much in the same position as the FAA is with aviation, managing regulation of shipping and everything related to that. It's a real quandary. Added to that, I didn't bring Pareto into the argument here if we could. It's this optimal allocation of resources between the public sector, what are public goods, what are private goods, what's the best and most efficient way to allocate those resources. And I would tell you now that's becoming blurred. I'm an advisor to Robert Cardillo at NGA, and right now the advent of commercial imagery, space imagery, is forcing them into a strategic discussion about what is the role of their agency. When things become commoditized and become as a service that were formerly only in the purview of the federal government to produce, it's going to raise issues about roles. And then further, how can the government keep up with the pace of technology and carry out the two things, acquire and deploy it for governmental purposes, and oversee it from a regulatory standpoint. I think we're at a real inflection point, because I don't see any of these trends slowing down or going away. And I think we're going to have to come to grips with them and solve the problems. Excuse me, maybe a final comment, because I know you want to get to Q&A. I was at a George Mason sponsored panel with Keith Alexander, former director of the NSA, a while back. In regards to cybersecurity, he actually started talking about the phrases in the preamble of the Constitution, common defense and the common welfare. What do those mean now in a society where national defense may not be solely owned by the government? And what does that mean now when the loss of our financial system may be a national security issue? But we wouldn't necessarily define it as that. I saw this very, very acutely during the oil spill. I was caught politically between BP's requirement to carry out the law and fix the problem under federal supervision, and the lack of relevancy that was felt clear to the Oval Office, and somehow BP was calling the shots. And I played that dynamic for 6 months until we got the well sealed and finally solved the problem. But the one thing you ever want to do is put a political leader in a crisis where they don't feel relevant, because then they're going to make it audible, and that may or may not be the right call. So I really think in a connected society where we don't have competent digital citizens, we've got a lot to talk about how we're going to solve these problems, and basically what constitutes general welfare and life and common defense.
There you go. Obviously, these problems aren't limited to telecommunications, and I know most of you guys are telecommunications professionals in this room. Jeff, you work with a company always pushing the boundaries of innovation in this space. What has been your experience, good or bad, with trying to get things through the FCC or any other agency that you had to work with to permit your products to come to market?
Well, one thing that I'm proud of is Dish. One of the adjectives, there are many adjectives used to describe Dish, but one of them certainly is disruptor. And we have been the beneficiary of government action. We've also been on the negative side of government inaction. In '92, Congress and the FCC did a few things. They passed the Cable Act. Cable was a monopoly, and part of that they created the retransmission consent regime, where cable companies would have to pay broadcasters for the right to distribute the signal. And the FCC decided to give away small dish licenses. And Charlie Ergen and Candy and their best friend Jim DeFranco were selling the big C-band dishes out of the back of their pickup truck. But we got some of these small dish licenses. And in 1995, Charlie and Candy and Jim put all their money on the back of a Chinese rocket. The one before ours blew up, the one after ours blew up. Ours launched. And our first customer was March of 1996, and 13 million customers later. It was because Dish and DirecTV, through government action, by giving us the ability to invest our money with the new technology, setting up a system where we had access to programming, where the cable companies didn't want to give us access to that programming, we were able to bring to the market needed competition. And cable is much better for it today. Some people credit satellite with motivating cable to go into broadband and not just the TV business. But the rules that were put in place in '92 for retransmission consent made sense at the time. How do you set up a system where consumers can get access to broadcast channels when you had a cable monopoly? Now, because there's so much competition in the cable, TV, satellite, over-the-top business, broadcasters, unfortunately, are taking advantage of rules from 1992 that essentially created government-sanctioned monopolies in the 210 TV markets throughout the country. So today, we are only permitted by rule and statute to negotiate with an ABC in Denver. We can't negotiate and bring in an out-of-market signal from an ABC in Los Angeles. And what has happened is the government helped facilitate disruptors to bring competition to a market, and now there's a lot of competition. And the broadcasters are taking advantage of this old regime by saying, hey, we're going to black out the signal. We're going to get customers pissed at the distributors so they leave. So the distributors are willing to pay more and more money to broadcasters. And it's something that the cable and satellite industry has been urging for needed reform. This is really an example of a well-intentioned rule that no longer is serving the marketplace. And we believe that Congress and the FCC, when faced with real competitive harm and consumer harm, when one entity in an industry is taking advantage of old rules, those rules should be reformed. And we have been supportive of a deregulatory approach. We supported Mr. Scalise's legislation that would remove the retransmission consent regime to bring needed competition. So we would be able to go to a different ABC and say, hey, let's look at the quality of your program. What price are you willing to charge? And create competition to a market that really consumers should be benefiting from, rather than seeing incessant price increases. And we have been sort of frustrated at the lack of government action to update or remove these old rules.
I think there's something that I picked up here. There's always, and I think about this in a number of cases that you see, there's this notion of say, permissionless innovation. But then you have an issue where somebody has an innovation that may impose a cost on somebody else. Okay? And I guess all innovation is intended to destroy to some extent. But we have property rights in our society, and you don't always get to destroy. I'm thinking of Spectrum, for example. You've got a case, the Light Squared case, where you've got this argument between the GPS community and an organization that's trying to repurpose 40 megahertz of satellite spectrum for terrestrial use, something that Dish has successfully done a few years ago. You've got another case where you have incumbent license holders in the 900 megahertz band, and you've got a process that's working fairly well. It's getting everybody to agree that we can move forward with rejiggering the way the spectrum is handled, with the incumbents being satisfied through financial or network replacement. What do we do in a world where we don't want permission necessarily to be a part of it, but we also have to recognize, that there are property rights that are being impeded on. Why don't you start?
Yeah, George, I spent a lot of time thinking about this, and it's going to be part of the topic of my next book, which is tentatively titled Making the World Safe for Innovation. And I spent a lot of time thinking about this particular problem, which goes by a lot of different names. Economists would talk about sunk costs, stranded assets, regulatory takings. Lawyers would talk about level playing fields, so on and so forth. At the end of the day, there's always this, what I call sort of an elusive search for a reparations policy for the regulatory sins of the past. Like, we've made mistakes, we've got investments, we've done things, and by God, we need to keep doing them. And like, no, you don't double down on failure, is my general first principle, or answer. But there is a legitimate complaint, not just emanating on the field of communications, but every field affected by disruptive innovation, by people who have played by the rules or made investments according to regulatory policies, and then all of a sudden, policies or technologies change. I mean, this is the whole fight about the sharing economy and things like Uber and Airbnb. I mean, transportation companies were playing by the rules, and the hospitality sector was paying a lot of taxes and imposing a lot of regulations by local regulators. And along come Uber and Airbnb as evasive entrepreneurs and engage in what I like to call technological civil disobedience, and just basically say no, boo-boo to the whole system and do an end run, right? Now, I'd like to think we're better off because they engaged in that behavior. And within 7 years, we've gone from not having any competition in those fields to having some pretty interesting options for the first time in a long time. A problem that we spent a full century trying to regulate to achieve better public interest or consumer welfare outputs. We failed. It was only when we got competition in the form of disruptive innovation that we had this benefit. But you know what? The transportation companies, the old taxi companies, and the old hotelers, they still have a point. They are burdened by taxes and regulations that the new kids in town aren't. So how do you deal with that? Well, I have a piece that I recently released on Medium about 3 reforms to make permissionless innovation a reality. And one of them I call the parity principle. And I'll just read it to you and then I'll explain what I mean by it. It says that any operator offering a similarly situated product or service should be regulated no more stringently than its least regulated competitor. What I mean by that is that when you have a level playing field problem, the real option should be not to regulate up to achieve parity, but to sort of deregulate down to get everybody on the same liberalized, even playing field. And so when the hotels say, oh my gosh, Airbnb, or when the taxis say, oh my gosh, Uber, well, you know what? Let's treat them more like Uber and Airbnb, not more like the old regulated and heavily taxed sectors. Now that's not easy to achieve in practice, because politics matters. And you know what? When you have a heavy tax base based on like regulating or taxing, there's going to be interest in preserving the status quo. But I think technological change is the real game changer here. Basically, you can't preserve the old system. You can't come up with that perfect reparations policy to rectify all the regulatory sensitivities. Something's got to change. So if we can achieve parity in this way, by the way, this provision, some of you may recognize it, it's basically the secret sauce that lies between free trade agreements. This is the MFN agreements. This is basically how we got around tariff barriers and got global trade going in the post-war period. We need the same policy approach we took towards breaking log jams in the trade markets to be applied to the regulatory world to achieve better parity through liberalization.
Thank you. Now, we were talking earlier about Nanny Boo Boo a little bit with Apple. Why don't you go through that case and share that with us?
Just real briefly, how many people have an iPhone? Okay, the GPS system in the United States is really called a Global Navigation Satellite System. There actually is an international community for GNSS in the United Nations. It's very loosely organized, not nearly what we have with aviation or maritime transportation systems. But there are 3 other major systems that are out there. The GLONASS system built by Russia, the Galileo system by the EU, and the Dago system by China. Every iPhone you have has a GLONASS chip in it. I believe there's also a requirement for any GPS receiver that's receiving a GNSS signal in the United States to actually be permitted by the FCC. And obviously Apple didn't wait. And I think Galileo is still waiting for action on their permit. So it's one of those things where technology is going to take off, markets are going to drive this, with permission notwithstanding. And Apple has a quandary where they have to sell these phones all over the world. And it just so happens that GLONASS receivers have a higher degree of accuracy and higher latitudes than GPS.
Where, in your experience, which is vast, have you seen an example or a model of where the government should be looking to see how to improve its processes for dealing with innovation, or no?
Well, let me give you a quandary. Maybe this is a better way to deal with it. I'm going to go from telecommunications to something pretty icky, but I'm talking about invasive species. Anybody ever heard about invasive species? Particularly the zebra mussels that are in the Great Lakes, clogging systems. A lot of those came through ballast water that was carried from foreign countries where there were no standards. The Coast Guard has been trying to put out a regulation for over 10 years to create a ballast water standard for invasive species. But the private sector has no incentive, nor have they come up with a technological way to meet the standard, because we don't go out and challenge innovation and put a technological fix out there, whether it's treating with ultraviolet light or screening systems or whatever. So we've been in a do loop of creating a standard that can be met by industry through command and control regulations for over a decade now, and we're not in compliance with an act that was passed in the early 1990s.
I guess the answer is no. While you're at the FCC, I suspect that Chairman Pai is what I've seen, would like to reduce red tape. He's made a number of proposals to try to get the government to work a little better and a little faster. I know you can't speak to particular cases, but what do you see from the Economist position, from a strategic position, as the drivers of the thought process and how to make that work. What does the government need to be doing? Where does it need to focus? What are the key cost and benefits of trying to reform and reduce red tape?
As I started with the policymakers in general, this attitude towards innovation and regulation, that would be across government agencies, extremely important. Just not be in the business of protecting existing technologies, existing businesses, existing anything, but rather allowing the market to work. So that's kind of a good general principle that allows for creative destruction to happen, and we really thwart it at our peril. Within the FCC, as you know, as you mentioned at the beginning, there's an interest on the part of the chairman to establish an office that would help economists basically be used more effectively and more consistently across the Commission's various activities. Economists work in rulemakings, transactions, auction design, data review reports, etc. And with regard to policy making in general, I think the idea of having the economists in early in the process, asking particular questions that economists are known to do, sometimes difficult questions, following something similar to regulatory impact analysis, or just good, what one would call good standard economic analysis for the problems that are before us. It's just very good standard practice. And what do I mean by that? When you're looking at any particular issue before any government agency, one should ask, is there a market failure here? What is the problem? Is it a problem that government needs to fix, or might the market fix? Might the next technological innovation address it? If the answer is, well, actually, this is a market failure, and there's something very useful the government could do, consider different options for doing that, and actually engaging in analysis of the costs and benefits of different strategies to address that. Fairly basic economic analysis, but applying that consistently across the various issues that come before the Commission would be extremely helpful.
I've seen a recent case, the notice on the 900 megahertz issue the Commission released, and I thought that would have been a great opportunity for the Commission actually to say, how do we deal with this guy and that guy, and how do we get this service line up with that service, and how do we appease this group and that group, which it does, very lengthy discussion. But rather say, how do we design or set up rules that allow the market to solve this problem without us having to make all these decisions? And I haven't seen it yet. It'd be interesting to see if the Commission down the road asks, instead of proposing a bunch of rules to solve problems, to say, how do I propose a bunch of rules that allow market transactions to solve problems instead? There's just completely different mentality about how you draft. If you've got spectrum, for example, and you want to repurpose it for some other use, and we're going to have to do that. We're not making this stuff in some factory, right? We're going to have to take spectrum used for one purpose and transition it to another that's more valuable. We've done it with reverse auctions. We've done it in many cases with spectrum where the government's had it, and we took 30 years to repurpose it and auction it. Every now and then we make money. We don't have to do it that way. We just need to get it into operation so that the benefits will flow from spectrum whether it's auctioned or not. It's just whether the government gets its cut. But it'll get its cut with taxation later down the road. But if you've got a situation, for example, where someone owns spectrum, or somebody's licensed to spectrum, which is always kind of squirrely whether or not they really have a right or not. It wasn't clear that the broadcasters really had a right to take a cut of the spectrum auctions for the TV spectrum. But if you've got a situation where a person has a license, has acquired a license, wants to repurpose it for some other use, and is able to deal with any incumbent licensee and say, well, I need to move you from from this band to that band, or I'm going to give you a different technology, and everybody sort of says, okay, we're good. You know, should it take 10 years for the FCC to go through a process to say, okay, we're good, when we already know we're good, right? Jeff, you can speak to that.
Yeah, well, it shouldn't take 10 years. And our AWS-4 spectrum is a perfect example of the FCC looking at old rules and changing those rules and allowing the company to innovate. So Dish spent $4 billion to buy 40 megahertz of satellite spectrum from two bankrupt companies called TerreStar and DBSD in 2010. And the FCC had imposed rules on this spectrum that required every device sold to have an integrated satellite and terrestrial chip in it. So a technology mandate. In their wisdom, that's what they decided to do for this spectrum. Not surprisingly, innovators, businesses had failed and went into bankruptcy. Dish took a risk and bought this spectrum with no expectation that the FCC would change the rules. But on a bipartisan basis, after about 2 years of working with the FCC removed those technology mandates and made the spectrum full terrestrial, like AT&T, Verizon spectrum. And there were some issues, of course, that limited our utility of the spectrum that then 2 years later were fixed. And now we have 40 megahertz of downlink spectrum that we are using as part of our IoT build. We are focused on deploying a nationwide wireless network that's focused on the Internet of Things by March 2020 as we move into 5G. And the core piece of spectrum for that is AWS-4. And but for the FCC taking a look at rules that no longer made sense and making changes, that spectrum probably would have remained fallow and unused. I think the FCC with Spectrum Frontiers is generally doing a good job by similarly looking at bands that had rules that no longer make sense and modifying those rules and licensees getting the benefit of the rules. I think that is fine because if a company can get appropriate rule changes, I think that encourages investment and deployment, and as we enter this new world of 5G and IoT and connectivity, that's exactly what we want to happen. And the more spectrum that the FCC can free up, we actually have 500 megahertz of spectrum, that's our satellite spectrum, that we're asking the FCC to do a Spectrum Frontiers to, and to share with satellite. Because right now the terrestrial rules on this spectrum limit it to one-way, low power use, about the power of 1/100th of a light bulb. That is not a good rule for investment. So we're asking the FCC to free up that spectrum so it could be used for 5G use while sharing with Dish and DirecTV satellite services.
George, another way of answering your question is just to make sure that the Commission is enforcing policies that are already on the book that could open up the door to more innovation. There's language that Congress has given the Commission, the FCC, and also many other agencies to engage in sort of forbearance when they think that there might not be the need for more advanced regulation. Or they can do things like we see in Section 7A and B of the Communications Act, which basically, as most of you know, reads that any person or party other than the Commission who opposes a new technology or service proposed to be permitted on this chapter shall have the burden to demonstrate that such proposal is inconsistent with the public interest. And then importantly, and often forgotten, is Section 7B, which puts a timetable on this. And it says basically the Commission initiates proceeding on this, it will be completed within 12 months after it's initiated. This is what we like to call the innovator's presumption at Mercatus, because this is basically affirmative language that says that new innovators and ideas are, again, innocent until proven guilty. And that you should take some action when you have new ideas, and you should do it on an expedited basis. Because we're no longer in the world where we can spend 5 to 10 years waiting. We need to get this done in like 12 to 24 months. And basically, that's the kind of idea that is already in law, but just not being enforced. And the real problem with this provision, 7A in particular, is that it doesn't apply to the Commission itself. It applies to outside parties to come and make the case. Well, we should say that the burden lies on the Commission itself to make the case that, like, why can't this innovation go forward? So I've extended this principle in this latest essay I just wrote on converting ideas, how to convert public policy to make it more like public permissionless innovation, to basically say this innovator's presumption should be applied across the communications and high-tech landscape and emerging tech landscape, such that the burden is on somebody else to make the case for extending regulation, preserving regulation, or imposing new ones. And if you can't do it in a certain timetable, then what I call the sunsetting imperative kicks in, which is that you've got 12 months to 24 months to basically get this done. Basically, it's like Moore's Law for tech policy.
You know, all these things are already used. Presumption is important in telecom. Sunsetting and time constraints, these are things that are used. Forbearance is an interesting case. I thought that was how the FCC deregulated itself and stole people's due process rights. I didn't know it was actually for companies to actually do things. Admiral, I know, I mean, we talk about innovation, sometimes we talk about big things. There's a lot of little things. I was watching a show on feeding the people of Puerto Rico the other day, and how a lot of private citizens have had to go down there and do a lot of the work themselves. And one of the famous chefs there said FEMA needs to put the emergency back into its name because he just couldn't get anything done. He was there, he was cooking 100,000 meals a day, and he just couldn't get any help. Not because the people were mean, but they were just strung up, you know, with red tape and bureaucracy. You're trying to plug a hole a mile deep in the Gulf of Mexico, which it's not unlike network neutrality. I mean, we had 12-year-old kids telling them how to do it on the Today Show every morning for a depth that even our best submarines won't go half that deep. So it's quite an engineering feat. What are their innovations in that case, and even in Katrina, whether they're policy innovations, technological innovations, that you were able to work through the process and get something done quickly that normally wouldn't? And is that kind of opportunity a reality, or is it just the red tape's the red tape and don't do it, don't ask permission, or?
Yeah, well, it's an interesting question in both cases, and they were radically different. The key to success was creating unity of effort, horizontally across agencies and vertically across governments, where you had no legal mandate to direct, but you had to create a shared sense of responsibility. I think ultimately that's where we're going to go. A lot of these situations have to be public-private partnerships, where you come up with a standard of care or something that becomes a best practice that can be incorporated by legislation and have to go through a rulemaking process. I think that's where we're ultimately going to have to go here. But in Katrina, the problem was that under the 10th Amendment, you can't, all powers not granted to the federal government reserved to the states. And that's disaster response. And the problem was local government would not admit that they had lost continuity of government. There was no legal premise for the federal government to preempt them for a week. They sat there looking at each other while we had a meltdown in the Superdome in the convention center. And when I got there, my challenge was to bring everybody together, create unity of effort, start working across lines, and create trust that allows you to do that. And I think ultimately, we have to do governing forms and that allow us to create unity of effort to best serve the public, common welfare, common defense, we talked about earlier. It was more of a regulatory environment in the oil spill. The oil spill was 45 miles offshore. The well was 5,000 feet deep in the water, and no human access, and the reservoir was another 12,000 feet. So for a vessel on the surface, it was 3 miles to the oil. And one thing I never could get an answer on, and from a regulatory standpoint, the way things are set up in this country, the Outer Continental Shelf is managed by the Department of Interior, including the leases for the oil companies. The safety of the drilling unit is the responsibility of the Coast Guard. And I've asked Congress and everybody, a lot of lawyers, where in the riser pipe that authority changes. And nobody's been able to tell me, so it required me to sit down with Secretary Salazar, the Department of Interior, and actually just work together and manage the problem on the ground to fix it the best way you could. Now, there were still regulatory issues that BP had to comply with in terms of the engineering design of the capping stack and that sort of thing. But it all ultimately came back to me issuing an order as a national incident commander that they had to comply with under through the civil penalty or criminal penalty. So that regulatory structure, which actually came from the Exxon Valdez, provided us the tools that actually allowed us to succeed with the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. So we're on the cusp here, where there's this dynamic between command and control, protecting the public interest, and not inhibiting technology in advancing this stuff forward. And I think we're going to have to find some new way to have that conversation and just make it happen faster. Otherwise, I don't think we're going to be serving the public well, whether it's a regulatory issue about repurposing spectrum or meeting the expectations of the American public about what a whole of government response is like in terms of a disaster response.
And sometimes the government could do a lot of good without actually passing a law, repealing a law, getting rid of a rule, or passing a rule, just by saying something. The power of the government, the bully pulpit, to encourage innovation is enormously powerful. And one example from Dish, we had a technology called Sling that allowed a cable or satellite subscriber to use a Sling box to watch their TV on their iPad or their iPhone. We thought it was great for consumers. They were already paying for the original cable or satellite. We went to the Copyright Office, who typically is known for being very pro-copyright holder, and we showed them the technology. We brought in the inventors, the Krikorian brothers, and explained to them, hey, this is great for consumers, this is not piracy, they're paying, we're respecting copyright. And the Copyright Office in their yearly copyright report talked about Sling and said that they thought it was fair use. And just that one quote really gave us confidence, and it gave other companies confidence. Hey, this is, if you empower companies to do something that's good for consumers, that still respects copyright, is not piracy, one line encouraged innovation. It didn't require 10-year rulemaking. We didn't need to go to Congress. It was just smart folks at the Copyright Office who understood the technology and said, you know what, if I just say something positive, that can make a difference. Little things like that, I think, matter.
I've often wondered why the commission doesn't do the same thing, and I'll ask you about this in a minute, Wayne. You see somebody use statistics, you see economic argument being made, and every economist knows it's garbage, you know. And why can't the FCC step and say, this is garbage, we're not going to use this is not probative for this proceeding, right up front? It's not unlike, there's been one more case where they actually did that, and I can't remember exactly what it was, but there was also the unthinkable merger, right? When Reed Hunt said that the AT&T-SBC merger was unthinkable, and it just shut the thing down. I mean, it just stopped. It stopped it dead in its tracks. And I think you could probably clean up a lot of the process and the record evidence by sort of jumping out front and saying, this is nonsense, we're not going to pay any attention to it. Have an economist write a paper or whatever, and so we're just going to take this off the table, which is not unlike that. Adam's smiling. He's got some examples.
Well, I think this does happen, but I think it happens mostly in the negative direction, like the unthinkable merger quote. It happens in the form of agency threats and what is often been called regulation by raised eyebrow. I mean, this term of art came about because of the way that the FCC and several sitting commissioners and chairmen were using the power of the bully pulpit to basically go to like annual NAB conventions and say, what are you going to be putting on prime time today? And then all of a sudden it wasn't on prime time, and censorship just happened, but we didn't have any rule passed, right? So that's unaccountable, arbitrary government. You know, that's not something we generally want to be encouraging. Now, if it would result in more like pro-innovation, sort of pro-market kind of things, it would go like, oh yes, bravo, bravo. I can't really cite a lot of examples like that, and I wish I could. Now, I can cite very high-level efforts by government officials to encourage innovation. I think this example that you gave is an excellent one. But even at higher level, you think about what the Clinton administration did in the mid to late 90s to use the power of the bully pulpit to say that the internet and the digital economy should be treated as a market-driven arena, generally free of old legacy regulations. And they did this in the form of a document called The Framework for Global Electronic Commerce in 1997, written by Ira Magaziner, and then really pushed by Al Gore. And a lot of conservatives and Republicans are always giving Al Gore a hard time in the Clinton administration. But when I was at the Heritage Foundation for all that time, I was writing papers galore saying, this is the greatest document I've ever read in my life. This is exactly how you want to use the power of the bully pulpit. Back then we didn't use the phrase, but that was essentially enshrining a vision of permissionless innovation in place for the internet and the digital economy at a very high level. And we adopted that hands-off approach for the most part for the internet, while Europe took a totally different approach, and the rest, as they say, is history. All of the world's household names for technology policy are American-based companies. That's why the Europeans hate us so much, right? They have no homegrown innovation. Name a major innovator from Europe in that space. You just can't. So yes, we use the power of the bully pulpit and the vision thing, as I call it, at a high level sometimes. We're doing this right now with the IoT. We've been trying to do this with the IoT, with like the IoT task force in Congress, the caucus, trying to push it and say we need to like capitalize on this. We do it a little bit with other sectors like driverless cars. But it has to be translated into concrete policy reforms. At some point it has to be very accountable types of things like the innovator's presumption idea or the sunsetting requirement. And they need to be written into law, and Congress has to play its legitimate oversight role. And it's just not. I mean, part of my problem with a lot of this discussion that we have about how to encourage innovation is that Congress is completely MIA. They just don't do anything to constrain agency power or budgets. And the only time they really get hot and bothered about it is when the agency does something particularly stupid, then they hold a hearing or two, and then it's all done, right? And then they just delegate more broad, ambiguous language to the agency and then hope and pray, like, please say something good or do something good. Well, that doesn't.
Problem is most of our thinking about government needs a government from some parallel universe to actually make it work, because it works pretty horrifically most of the time, which is unfortunate. Economics shop, an analytics shop at the FCC, you probably can't give us a lot of detail, but what can you tell us about that, and what impact do you think it's really going to have at the Commission?
So the chairman said he wanted to get an economic shop set up towards the end of this year, beginning next year. We're moving very quickly to, as quick as we can, to make this happen. There are many boxes to check and many steps to take along the way. So these kind of processes are in place. There will be movement early into next year to set this up. That's going to happen. And I think it's a very good thing, not just for giving economists a voice within the Commission, but just for having certain questions asked regularly, consistently, to advise policy. We're talking a lot, I was talking about the quality decisions, the types of decisions that are made by policymakers. And by the way, within the commission, economists are very clear, and we have a particular role to advise. And at the end of the day, the decisions are made by the chairman and the commissioners. They're the ones who are appointed and confirmed by the Senate. And they are guided by and try very hard to be consistent with the law. So, there are a lot of things that we're optimizing within a particular framework here. And that's really important to understand. But the economists can provide very useful analysis to say you're different. This is a situation where a government response may be appropriate. Here are particular approaches that can be used, option A, option B, option C. And the commissioners may say, and I see your analysis, and it appears that option B has the highest net benefit, and nonetheless I'm going with option C for these other reasons. And that is okay. But at least they're informed. So that if they say, I'm going with a different option for these other reasons, that at least they understand the value of, as presented by the economists, the net benefits of each different approach. And if they wish to consider other public interest obligations or other public interest concerns that they find hard to quantify, at least they realize, well, there better be some of the benefit of going with option C, because it's clear that the economists have laid out the pros and cons of the different approaches. So this part of the conversation, I think, is going to be very useful.
I hope that works out. When I was at the FCC, they brought all the economists to the 8th floor of 1990, and it was Reed Hunt, Michael Cass was the chief economist at the time. The economists were told that we were not there to help formulate the answers. We were there to support or provide the means to support whatever answer was given to us, which I think is a bit backwards. And I think part of the problem is that the leadership of these agencies don't.
It is backwards.
It is, well, it's to us. The economists, we can't answer every question, okay? And really, if you put an economist in a room, they're not going to give you an answer, most likely. They're going to give you lots of answers. It's the old one-armed economist, bring you a one-armed economist, because we're always, on the one hand and then the other. So, but what economics, I think, does, and analytics does, is keep you from doing really stupid things. And you get down to the end, and there's some empirical relationships, parameters of the model, that we don't know the size of, and we can't tell you the size of. And sometimes you just have to make a policy decision to say, well, I think this is bigger than that, and we'll go forward with it. We're gonna finish up here with one more question I wanted to ask Admiral Allen. Since we're talking about analytics and economists, what has been your experience in government of dealing with analytical teams? Are the politics so overwhelming that the analytics is not important, or does coming to the issue with good analytics really help improve outcomes?
Well, I think it's a desire inside any agency to have as thorough, critical, and accurate research and development of ideas as you can. The problem is whether it's regulatory or budgetary estimates, the further away they get from you physically, the more they're reviewed in a political, more arbitrary manner. Our budget presentations, our analytics for rulemaking go up there to 3 decimal places, and all of a sudden everything's rounded to $100,000 in the budget. You're trying to make an offense on policy. It's that type of environment, and I would tell you, since the Budget and Accounting Act of 1920 created GAO in the Office of the Budget in the Treasury, we migrated under Roosevelt to the Office of the Budget and the Office of Management and Budget. There's been a slow politicization of OMB that I think probably bears some watching, and you could say that extends into IRA too, based on what administration you have coming into account. But this gets back to the death of expertise. I have a chair at the Coast Guard Academy in Operations Research and Computer Analytics, data analytics with the opportunity that's presented to us by computation and things that are out there right now. If we don't take advantage of that and serving the public, making better decisions, then we're failing to employ technology, and we're making a better case for these people to go out without permission to do what they want to do because we're not acting responsibly. I testified before Congress after the Deepwater Horizon oil spill that we needed the landmark legislation that we got after the Exxon Valdez that created a framework between the private sector and the government that allowed us actually to succeed ultimately in capping that well. Unfortunately, without that congressional oversight, which you ultimately need to establish a baseline, it's very, very hard. And right now, at least in my view, Congress is that body that engages in random acts of aftersight.
Well, this has been an interesting conversation. I hope you enjoyed it, and think that we need to really think hard about reinventing government. It sounds to me that there's a lot of changes that need to happen to make things work a little better. But please give a round of applause to our excellent panelists here. 5-minute coffee break, and then we'll return for our legal analysis.